More than 3,000 years ago, Ugarit was a sophisticated and multicultural city of trade, much like New York City, located along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. It was part of a global trade network, a rich civilization that spanned the eastern Mediterranean and nearby islands. I first heard about it when I read Eric Klein's book, 1177 BC, the subtitle of that being The Year Civilization Collapsed, which is a pretty potent subtitle, and it certainly got my attention. The collapse, it described how this brilliant civilization collapsed, apparently overtaken by marauding sea raiders. They're called the Sea Peoples. There might have been other causations as well, but they're the most dramatic of the various threats faced by this ancient civilization. The ruins of Ugarit, the city was destroyed. It was left only as ruins. The ruins of Ugarit and the other cities were discovered only 100 years ago. In the ruins, they found clay tablets and clay tablets written in the special language of Ugarit. And when these clay tablets were translated, the king was begging for help from a neighboring kingdom. The scene seems so cinematic. What I was reading was a desperate plea for help from one king to another. I thought, as I read this, somebody should write a book about it, or a movie. So I wrote a book. The story became even more poignant when we were under, what do they call it, stay-at-home orders for COVID, which I thought of as house arrest. And the question became, are we going to survive this pandemic or not? I became more sensitive to the plight of the ancient Ugaritics because they faced an existential crisis, perhaps of a greater magnitude, as to whether they were going to survive. What follows in this presentation are 4 sections. The first is a prologue, giving some sense of where Ugarit lay in the ancient Mediterranean, who were their neighbors to the north and to the south. Then, just for fun, we're going to take a city tour with a woman healer from the lower city. This is actually a chapter from the book. And the city tour features an encounter with a prophet who's predicting doom. The next section is going to be the great storm, the storm approaching the city and its imminent destruction. And finally, a small epilogue about what happened in the area after the collapse of Ugarit and the other cities. So here comes the prologue. Ugarit thrived on the Mediterranean coast. Every day, ships docked in its harbor. They brought gold from Egypt, copper from Cyprus, tin from distant Afghanistan. They came by caravan, by the way. They didn't come by ship. And that's what this civilization needed to make the bronze that created the chariots for the Hittites and the Egyptians, the bronze that made the great swords. This was basically a global economy, globalism, something we've heard of lately. Trade routes were crisscrossing the Mediterranean. There was trade between one city and another. By the way, trade is one way to maintain allies and avoid war, which was a lesson they knew about back then, but we may have forgotten. So now we're going to go to a map of the area and show you how Ugarit lays at the northern margin of Syria, what's now Syria, but it was actually at the northern margin of what was Canaan, the land of Canaan. And to the north were the Hittites. The Hittites was a mighty empire, rather newly formed empire, and it had fairly recently taken over the city of Ugarit, and it had become a vassal to the Hittites. The Hittites were not particularly gifted when it came to the arts. Here is the best picture I could find of some artifact from the Hittite Empire, and it shows a picture of the Lion Gate massive gate with 2 lions that are guarding the city walls, huge city walls that surrounded its capital. So they were masters of war, but not masters of art. Egypt was the other mighty empire in the Mediterranean basin. We all know about Egypt. Those ruins were discovered, 1840 or something. We've had ample translation of the hieroglyphics, so we're all impressed with the wonders of Egypt. Egypt had actually been controlling Ugarit for some hundreds of years before the Hittites won a battle and they got control. And I mention that because the Ugaritics were very fond of Egyptian art and artisans and architecture. And we'll see that later on in our story. And Egypt was also literate. They had the hieroglyphics and they left innumerable stories and documents for us to read. Ugarit was a bustling trade hub for the Eastern Mediterranean. Letters came, brought by emissaries from other kingdoms. The scribes recorded the letters and the communication back and forth, and we found all the scribal data in the ruins of the city. What Ugarit did not know and what the Eastern Mediterranean did not know was that there was a storm brewing, probably further north. There was maybe famine, there was certainly war, there was havoc, and the peoples in the north were moving south. They were fleeing whatever they were facing in their own lands and heading towards the Mediterranean, seeking either food, grain, fertile land, or some of them just seeking gold, silver, and bronze. And they became sea traders, the ones seeking the raiders, just like the Vikings that occurred 2,000 years later. They mastered swift flying ships that could land quickly on a beach and overtake a city, just like the Vikings. So now we're on the part where we're actually in a chapter in the book in the story of Yoninah and Badel. Yoninah, a favorite character of mine, she's a healer in the lower city, offering herbal remedies to her clients. This is before the age of doctors. She gave medicines for pain, she gave medicines for nausea, she gave medicine for seasickness, she gave medicine to help people sleep. In addition to her medicine, she also provided amulets, magical invocations for the protection of the gods. And this trip through the city, which she took with her little daughter, Badel, was their favorite part of the week. As they walk along, they followed Palace Street, which runs through the lower city, and it was lined with modest houses and modest shops. And as they made their way along the narrow street, Badel, the little 10-year-old girl, cries out, "Oh, look, Mom." No, maybe not Mom, she would have been another name, Ima. "There's the monkey man." Tucked into a doorway stood a man with a monkey perched on his shoulder. The little creature had extended its hand, begging, and they gave it dates, which it accepted eagerly. They then passed sailors in short tunics. They'd come off the boats that were the harbor was half a mile away. They were on shore leave. And they were talking, the sailors were calling out in their various languages, a whole cacophony of different languages, Mycenaean, Ugaritic, Egyptian, even Hittites. And from what Yoninah could tell, they were on the lookout for taverns and probably for female companionship. As they passed further along the street, they came to the shop that sold household idols. Yoninah and her daughter admired a curvaceous terracotta figure of Asherah. There were also bronze medallions of Asherah. And she was the goddess of fertility, the protector of women and children, the most beloved of the household gods, and the favorite. Yoninah bought several of these figures to sell at her own shop. And nearby stood a bronze statue of Baal. Baal was a fierce-looking figure, his right arm raised, holding a lightning bolt. In the other hand, he held a tree branch. The lightning bolt signified his control over the storms, over thunder and lightning. And the tree branch represented the fact that he was the keeper of the storms, the keeper of the rain, and you needed his goodwill to keep your crops growing. As they passed a little, they weren't going to buy the statue of Baal. It was trimmed with gold. It was well beyond their budget. But as they proceeded up Palace Street, they came to a cluster of people in the narrow road. And the people were gathered around a wildly gesticulating figure, a man with wild gray hair and disheveled appearance. "The city is doomed," he cried. "Lord Baal spoke to me. I was asleep, and he sent me a vision. He's told me to tell the people, you will hear the ram's horns, the blasts of war. The city walls will fall. You will flee before the swords and archers. Ugarit will be destroyed." Well, they were used to seeing prophets on the streets, doomsayers. It's one of the hazards of life at that time. Sometimes the prophets were wandering in the hills as well. The onlookers muttered to themselves, "He is mad." They didn't take him seriously. They didn't pay him much mind. It was hard to pay him much mind when the colors of the spring flowers around them were bright, the sky was clear, the women were passing in their flowing tunics, the young sailors with their boasts and jeers. At the top of the hill, Yoninah and Baal reached the upper city. Now that was a much higher class of buildings and of shops. In the harbor, they could look down from the height of the upper city and see the glistening waves of the Great Sea off to the west. Yoninah found her vendor on a back street. He had purchased under the table the wares that he sold. You really weren't supposed to sell direct. The sailors weren't supposed to secrete their goods in pockets and sell them on their own initiative. They were supposed to go through the king's markets. But nonetheless, she was able to find her wares, and she was happy to make her way back down from the height of the city back to her home, grateful for having had a lovely day and in a spring day in Ugarit, just a little bit perturbed by the prophet of doom. So we left the story of traveling on a shopping street and whatever, and now we're moved ahead to later in the summer. It's midsummer now. Dire signs have shown up. There's the sign of the solar eclipse, which had happened early summer, and the astrologer from the court had declared that a sign of coming war. That wasn't good. Then there were rumors. There were rumors of sea raiders attacking cities in the Aegean, a bit to the west and to the north. And then a message came to the king of Ugarit, from the Hittite king, and he said, "We are under attack. My capital is under attack. There are foreign soldiers at our gates. Send your army." And a week later, another letter from the king of the Hittites to the king of Ugarit. "Our seaports are under attack. Send your navy." Now, Ugarit had to comply with this. The treaty they had signed with the Hittites had included a binding agreement of mutual support. So if their overlords, the Hittites, demanded the navy and demanded the army, they had no choice but to send them. So the city entered a time of great anxiety. Everyone knew that the army was gone, the sailors were gone, people were missing their sons and their husbands, and Yoninah saw more people in her shop, invariably women, who were asking for help with the bad dreams they were having and asking for amulets, invoking the protection of the gods for their husbands and sons. So with the city's army and navy gone, Ugarit was largely unprotected. Everyone knew this. In the oppressive summer heat, wealthy citizens of the upper city fled to their summer homes in the mountains. The poor in the lower city, they had no such option. They turned to Yoninah, asking for more sleeping draughts and more amulets. Then came an even more dreadful warning. Enemy ships were sighted off the coast. We know this much about the last days of the city because, again, of the cuneiform tablets that were found in the palace. They were fired in the burning of the city and thus hardened. They were baked and thus preserved for 3,000 years. The most poignant of them was written by the king to be sent to the king of Cyprus, and it's shown here. It read as follows: "Let my father know. My father, enemy ships are coming. They have burned my towns with fire. My troops are in Kati, the Hittite land. My ships are in Luca, on the shore of the Aegean. My father must know this." And he'd asked Cyprus to send ships, and Cyprus did not respond promptly. The king would have warned the people to prepare for evacuation, to pack their bags, grab their children, be ready to flee the city if the enemy ships were sighted, and to head east into the mountains to seek sanctuary in the towns in the mountains. The king would have stationed lookouts on the watchtowers, ready to sound the ram's horns at the first sign of the enemy. And the horns were sounded. And the people fled through the streets while arrows were flying overhead from the attackers at the gates. The sea peoples, the attacking marauders, would have landed their ships quickly and easily, offloaded their warriors, and quickly descended on the city's gates. They would have overcome what little defense the city could raise. They would have headed quickly towards the palace and the temple, looking for the gold and silver and bronze they could take. They probably took some amount of wheat and some amount of wine for some sustenance in the interim until they made it to their next destination. They would have torched the palace and the temple quarters as they left, and for good measure, they torched the lower city behind them as they made it back to their ships. The city burned, was left as ruins. When the ruins of Ugarit were unearthed in 1928, archaeologists found layers of ash, shattered stone walls, and arrowheads scattered throughout the streets. They found few skeletons, suggesting that much of the population had successfully escaped the city and the fires. Among the most remarkable discoveries were thousands of clay tablets. Once translated, scholars learned that the language of Ugarit was closely related to Hebrew. Both were Western Semitic. Speakers of one would have understood the other, and the tablets were a marvel. They contained religious myth, they contained poems, they contained administrative records and trade agreements. The scribes of Ugarit liked to write, and the merchants liked to collect the clay tablets in massive libraries, and the king had a massive library. Together with the artifacts found at these various sites, including the stray bronze statues or pots or figures that were left behind, these artifacts enable to reconstruct us what life was like in the city of Ugarit when it was thriving. The storm that took Ugarit, the attack of the marauders, did not stop there. The chaos continued, and the sea raiders and the chaos they brought continued to destroy scores of cities along the eastern Mediterranean. It was a time of chaos across Canaan and the eastern Mediterranean. Hundreds of cities crumbled. The Hittite Empire collapsed. Egypt, though not destroyed, emerged weakened and diminished after fighting off the sea raiders. Modern scholars call this era the collapse of the Bronze Age. A new age began, one that included the arrival of the Israelites, crossing over the Jordan River and into Canaan. They would have been familiar with the Canaanites who lived in the land. They would have been listening to their stories and myths and poems. And the Israelites who crossed over, they left us the stories of the Hebrew Bible, the stories probably arose not too long after the massive collapse of the Bronze Age. And in the ashes of Ugarit's shattered trade empire, a new power emerged, the Phoenicians, who rose to dominate the seaborne trade routes once controlled by Ugarit. So with the end of the Bronze Age and the collapse of those cities, there was perhaps a period of darkness and a lack of literacy, but then a new age arose. And that's the age we hear about, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, and brings us up to current times. This book was partly inspired by a couple sources which are interesting. One is Homer's Odyssey, tales of the Trojan War, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Trojan War took place at about the same time as the story of Ugarit in the late Bronze Age. So that's a source of information about Moors and mores and weaponry that may have well been part of the story of Ugarit. And the other source of inspiration was the Hebrew Bible. The biblical writers, as I said, were familiar with Canaanite and Ugaritic literature. They denounced Asherah and Baal worship. They were keenly aware of it. They did, however, adopt some of the metaphors and literary devices from their Canaanite neighbors, and you can see that especially in some of the books of the Bible, especially the Psalms. So I did borrow a few biblical passages which inspired some of the tales in this story. Here's a picture of the cover of my book. For more stories about ancient Ugaritic, I encourage you to read my book, Ugarit, Tales from a Lost City. You can follow Yoninah as she tends to her clients, who are interesting. I used to be a physician, so I know what interesting is. And as she and her family flee the city and try to find safety in the mountains to the west. This book is soon to be published by Historian Press. And for further information, it's coming out in September. For further information, you are more than welcome to visit the website at jtamaren.com. And there is going to be some teasers about some other interesting stories from the book if you happen to drop by the website. And thank you for your attention.